So welcome everyone to the final CCPO-ICAR seminar for the spring 2025 semester. I hope you've enjoyed the different sessions that we've had so far. I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Lubell, who is a professor of environmental science and policy at UC Davis. He is a political scientist who focuses on cooperation problems in the context of environmental governance and has studied this question in the context of climate adaptation, water management, agricultural decision-making, and other environmental issues. He'll be talking today about the quest for cooperation in regional sea level rise adaptation. So I'm hoping that there are several lessons that we'll be able to learn from that experience and thinking about how that might apply in the Hampton Roads region and our local context. Mark, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction and inviting me to speak. Okay, so all my information is there. I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. I'm a political scientist by training. I study cooperation problems in the context of environmental governance, and I'm the co-director for the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior at UC Davis, which is kind of our research group where we study environmental governance across lots of different issues with my colleagues Gwen Arnold and Tyler Scott, and our sets of students and postdocs and whatnot. So the topic today is the quest for cooperation in regional sea level rise adaptation. And I was kind of a kid who played Dungeons and Dragons, and the Dungeons and Dragons movie came out a few years ago, and I found it highly entertaining. So you can kind of think of it like that. Lots of characters getting together to solve the quest and get the gold of more resilient communities at the end of the day. Let's see if this is working. Everybody's seen that change in slides?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I've been working on sea level rise adaptation and climate adaptation for a number of years now. I work with an engineer at UC Berkeley named Mark Stacy, who does a lot of analysis of hydrodynamic processes around coastal, sea level rise and infrastructure analysis. So we've had an NSF project that three NSF projects really that have linked these things together. And the most recent one is that one down there called Centering Equity and Coastal Community Resilience through the Confronting Hazard Impacts and Risk for Resilient Planet program, CHIRP. And that was awarded in January of this year under the Biden administration. And the money is actually flowing at the moment, but we don't know how long it's going to be flowing. So we'll have to see how that works going forward, and hope that it has all of the current administration's dirty words in it, as you can see. So I'm a little bit worried about that, but for the moment, we're moving forward with it. And through all this work, we really focus on the cooperation problems that are involved with sea level rise adaptation. And in my view, pretty much all climate adaptation issues have these interdependence problems. So on the left there, at least my left, shared experience, it's a cluster analysis that shows similarities between different communities in terms of the vulnerability to sea level rise in the Bay Area and the types of impacts and critical infrastructure that they have in those areas, which means that they share similar experiences if they're in the same cluster, and they can learn from each other. So you can spread knowledge across the region about the different planning approaches and adaptation pathways. The next one in the middle there is called vulnerability interdependence. And this is working with Mark and some traffic modelers. What we did is we simulated flooding Berkeley. So you see that blue circle there is we simulated what would happen to traffic if we flooded Berkeley. So I'm from UC Davis, Mark Stacy's from Berkeley, so I insisted that we flood Berkeley. So when you flood Berkeley and simulate that, what happens to traffic is you see regional traffic impacts because you're knocking out a lot of critical transportation routes in that area. And all around that, where you see the red and yellow, you see increases in traffic that's due to that local flooding. So it's not just a local problem, it's a regional problem where that vulnerability spreads and cascades across the region. And then in panel 3 there on the right is adaptation interdependence, where again, this is working with Mark. He simulated flooding each of these counties, and we have a more refined version of this now. This is kind of an early, easy to understand version, but we simulated, for example, flooding Alameda County. Hardening the infrastructure in Alameda County. So we simulated building seawalls, like we pretended we armored the entire shoreline of Alameda County, and then looked at how the water levels could be rise in other regions. So if you do local adaptation, it might be a gray infrastructure, a seawall, or even green infrastructure, and change the elevation in that local area. You have cascading effects through the hydrodynamics that could increase risk to other areas. So taken together, all of these types of interdependence means that you have to have cooperation at the regional level across many different local jurisdictions to effectively do climate adaptation. And so the goal of our research on my side of things, on the social science things, is to understand the governance of these sorts of problems and the sorts of planning and decision making that has to happen in order to try to get climate adaptation pathways that take into account these sorts of cooperation problems and interdependencies. That happens also at the hyper local level. So at some of the follow-up work we did to this is looking at different routes for trying to deal with a particular highway, Highway 37, which is in the North Bay. And it's basically, if you ever drive along and it's like going to Napa, you'll drive along and it's literally right at sea level, and you can see the wetlands all around you. And that to be able to fix problems at that local level, you also have to have that level of cooperation. So this is one of the quotes: one of the main challenges posed by sea level rise from a governance perspective is its novelty. There's no rule book for adaptation. Adaptation to sea level rise requires agencies and stakeholders to set aside their ways of doing things and move into uncharted territory. It requires them to collaborate horizontally with actors at the same level of governance and vertically with actors at different levels of governance. So that's something that my colleague Francesca Vantagiato wrote, who's been one of my main collaborators in this area in the Bay, this research. So we've done lots of stuff, done interviews of stakeholders, key informant interviews across multiple levels of government. We've done focus groups. I wrote a report all the way back in 2017 that identified the governance gap associated with sea level rise and delivered that report to all the stakeholders and interested parties around the Bay. It's been circulating and was well received. We did a survey, which I'll have a lot of information about in the rest of this talk. I continue to participate in the Bay Adapt planning process that's going on as a member of the leadership group and advisory committee, including working on environmental justice and equity issues. We just got that NSF grant I told you about that's really focused on community engagement and co-production with frontline communities in the Bay Area. With we and others, we're doing some more comparative research and trying to build out that, like looking at patterns of cooperation across Virginia, South Carolina, and California using the same survey research instrument. You'll get a little bit of that. And lots of publications on this coming out of all this work, with more kind of on deck right now. This is the survey that we did, just to give, because I'm going to give more information on some of the results in a bit. We had about a 22% response rate, with a lot of different issues that we covered in the survey. We had a big, huge list of people that we got that we compiled from various collaborative groups in the Bay Area to try to figure out who to survey. And hopefully we'll do this again, actually, in the next couple of years. So through all of this, these are what I think are the keys to cooperation in regional sea level rise adaptation. And I would say these are keys probably in all climate adaptation. network governance, climate adaptation planning, the funding portfolio, permitting, the climate science enterprise, how you link science to policy, civic engagement, and political leadership. On those big bold things on the left, where I'm going to talk about on the right, I just wanted to point out that in the governance gap report, we kind of thought of all of these as governance challenges of various sorts, and we did a bunch of focus groups and interviews to qualitative work to identify all of the different possible solutions that we might have to overcoming these governance challenges or pursuing the keys to cooperation. In the red there are at things at the time that we identified as like some of the key recommendations going forward. And I would say, like, as you go through this talk and where we have reached now, like there's been progress on all of these things pretty much along the lines that you see in these red highlights here. All right, so I'm going to go through these different keys to cooperation, and hopefully level everybody up, just like in Dungeons and Dragons. Excuse me. So the first key is network governance. When you look at these systems, these governance systems in which the climate adaptation takes place, and this is the same in all the regions that I've ever studied now, you have these polycentric systems, and this is one of our papers mapping out the sea level rise governance system around, as it was, say, around 2019 in the Bay Area. The blue squares there are different planning processes of various sorts, different collaborative management, planning, networks of various sorts, and the red circles are different agencies and organizations. A lot of them in the middle there are state and federal agencies. This is actually the core of the network. If I showed you the whole network, there's over 100 different blue squares and 300 different red circles. And this is what we call a polycentric system, because there's many different actors involved in many centers of decision making. All of these combined is what makes the governance system. So what you have to do is figure out how to get collaboration across these polycentric systems. The quote on the left there is from a guy named Phil Eisenberg, who was a veteran of California water policy and coastal policy for many, many years, former mayor of Sacramento. Sadly, he passed away a couple of years ago. But one of the really important leaders in a different paper that I had on water management that had a network like this, he was actually asked to give commentary on the paper for an academic article. And in that commentary, he wrote, "Public policy is almost always a mess. Let's acknowledge the inevitable and figure out how to manage a messy situation. Trying to define a policy problem is hard enough. Trying to find a solution is even harder. Trying to do either in a policy-making structure in which everyone is involved but nobody's in charge is nearly impossible." So that's really a feature of these systems. Everybody's involved, nobody's in charge. So governing these systems is really kind of the art of the impossible. But I do think it's not. It's something we definitely want to try to do. There's many different types of organizations. This is from the survey, and you can see the percentage of respondents to local governments, NGOs, consulting, research, design, state, environmental groups. The whole kind of cast of characters gets involved in the sea level rise problems. Some of them are specialized, right? Like all they do is sea level rise or climate adaptation. Lots of other ones, it's only part of the portfolio. So it's like they're getting involved as, it's part of the responsibility of what they do. And these systems have been really growing. So this is those blue squares I showed you. This is when they were basically born. So I'm in California. We like wine and we like the vintage of things. So what you see is like it was kind of a slow burn for a little bit. There's a number of forums that were around sea level rise adaptation, but they were really adding sea level rise adaptation to their existing portfolio. So like there's a Bay Area integrated water management plan. They started out as a collaborative process for doing water management, but then brought climate adaptation into it as the salience of sea level rise emerged. But then in the early, mid 2010 or so, it really started to accelerate. And this graph is like could be updated because it's still growing. So it's kind of a punctuated equilibrium where as the issue became more salient, the governance system evolved quite quickly with many, many different forums and many more actors getting involved over time. So that's actually, the system became more messy, more polycentric, and that's actually a healthy thing. You have a high capacity governance system out here in California, where everybody pretty much believes climate change is an actual thing, and there's a lot of resources at the state level and the local level that can be brought to bear. And in a healthy system like that, you get the growth of these systems. And collaboration evolves across that system. So, and it's not just in California. So we will probably be able to agree with me or confirm that these systems are very similar complexity in the Hampton Roads and South Carolina and pretty much everywhere you look. And these are the patterns of collaboration that we're doing in our comparative study. So some of this is from the survey that we did in California I showed you, but some of this is from almost the exact same survey instrument deployed in South Carolina and in Virginia. You can kind of see like sharing information and joint planning and funding proposals and implementing projects and the ranking of those things of what people do as far as collaboration is very, very similar across these regions. And you can kind of think of the ones at the top as like low cost collaboration, and as you go down, higher cost sorts of collaboration. And even across regions, we think there's some regional differences in terms of levels, but it's not like massive, right? Like one could argue maybe in planning and information sharing, Virginia's a little bit ahead, or maybe you could argue California has gone past that stage. But when you look at these regional comparisons at across the three regions we've looked at so far in our kind of incipient consortium, it's not radically different. And then key two, so that's kind of the network governance. How do you govern that messy network? Key two is the planning. And planning is part of the governance solution to that messy network. And the issue is that there's a lot more agreement on the problem than what we should do about it. So this is from our survey that says, how much do you agree on the risk versus actions? And what you see is like there's a fairly high level of agreement on the risk, is kind of the blue bar, but not very level of high agreement on what we should actually do about it. So, in so the first thing is people say, yeah, it's a problem, and then trying to figure out what to do about it in that messy system is a more difficult problem. And when we ask people in the Bay about what we should do about that problem, the number one solutions that were selected was create a regional sea level rise adaptation plan, create a collaborative partnership, and promote projects aimed at accommodating sea level rise with a focus on green infrastructure. But at the bottom of this is establishing a new regional authority or visioning process. So it's like everybody wants a plan, everybody wants collaboration, but who will make it and who will be in charge of it? Nobody wants a new authority to threaten the autonomy of the local governments or other agencies in there. And so how do you thread that needle? We need to collaborate. We need everybody working together, but we don't want anybody telling us what to do. We don't want one ring that rules them all, so to speak, that has the authority to compel action and collaboration among everybody. It's a very difficult, catch-22 sort of eye of the needle. You got governance that you have to thread there. So what's happening in the Bay Area is the main one is Bay Adapt, which is a planning process that's spearheaded by the Bay Conservation Development Commission. BCDC is a state level agency with a regional mandate that was created to actually permit development projects within San Francisco Bay, making sure that they're not doing bay fill. So now they have to come up with the plan for how you manage the expansion of the water in the bay instead of the fill. So Bay Adapt is the main planning process that we've had, and they've now finished that plan, and more things are forthcoming. I was involved with the leadership advisory group here, and it had a very multi-level type of planning process that kind of followed the typical kind of adaptation planning cycle in some ways, but then had a multi-level structure with a leadership advisory group starting things off, different working groups and different elements, and back and forth with public forums, kind of at the local level and local governments to try to come up with the final Bay Adapt platform, which now is we're working on implementing that platform. The Bay Adapt process has these guiding principles: collaboration, equity, and social vulnerability has always been a big part of it. Solving collaborative problems together. Don't move back or don't hold back early movers. So there were some people that were already doing climate adaptation projects, some local jurisdictions. And there was some worry that Bay Adapt was going to try to tell people not to do those things, even though they had them on deck. Mainly because, well, what happens if you build a sea level or you build a seawall in this jurisdiction? They're already planning on doing it. Like Foster City is the example that I think of. And it's going to, are we going to try to stop it? Because it could lead to increased risks. So there's that bit of a tension there. Focus on green infrastructure, but only where appropriate, and then like have more custom-based solutions. So across the Bay Area, there's lots of different sorts of communities, lots of different sorts of kind of shoreline structures. So where do what sorts of adaptation projects and pathways are appropriate given what the kind of social ecological context is? And one of the most important things where we are now on this is called regional shoreline adaptation planning. So to implement this, BCDC came up with the regional shoreline adaptation plan, and there's actually a state bill, Senate Bill 272, that mandates that local governments participate and develop their own sub-regional shoreline adaptation plan that is consistent with BCDC's regional plan, and actually has to be signed off by BCDC has to approve that plan. And within that planning process, and there's kind of the plan elements you see in the graphic on the right, within that planning process, they're expected to develop like the list of shoreline adaptation projects that they want to implement to kind of have the on the ground climate adaptation solutions. So first two keys, again, network governance, planning, then permitting. Okay, so in permitting, all these local shoreline adaptation projects have to get permits from lots of different agencies, local government agencies. BCDC is the state agency, often the Army Corps for like Section 404, regional water quality control for the Clean Water Act, species, nymphs, all kinds of different permits that need to be done. And also, very often there's a requirement for NEPA and definitely CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, environmental impact statements, and adaptation projects get treated the same. This is a quote: adaptation project from one of our interviews. Adaptation project get treated the same as someone putting up a Walmart. We got to jump through the same hoops, and it takes years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get permits. So how do we streamline that? One of the things that's happening around that is integrated permitting team called BRIT, the Bay Area Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, that takes all the agencies that you kind of see here in the blue boxes and brings them together collaboratively so that you have a single common application that then for these projects that are eligible for this, that then go through this BRIT process, and all the agencies work together to try to like streamline this permitting, make it less redundancy, less chance of having conflicting things. And they have to it doesn't change any of their authorities, that their legislative authorities, but they have to do a better job of working together to implement those legislative authorities. At the same time, there are things like trying to exempt these sorts of projects from things like CEQA and NEPA, which is interesting because these are environmental projects, and typically environmental groups are very against streamlining and trying to get regulatory relief for any sort of development project or infrastructure project. So there's a kind of an interesting tension there. Okay, key 4 is funding. These projects are very expensive. If you think about just locally, right? They're wetland restoration. We have a goal here of restoring 100,000 acres of wetlands with a price tag of 1.43 billion just for that. Just the first stage of the Embarcadero seawall. Those of you who've been in San Francisco, the Embarcadero is the area right down where all the ferries come in and all the tourists go, where Fisherman's Wharf is, that area. Just the first stage of upgrading the seawall there is 5 billion. And if you look at all, I'll show you a little bit more of this in a second. If you look at the estimate of all the infrastructure projects that are proposed or could potentially be done in the Bay Area, the midline price tag estimate is $110 billion. And that's like before anything happens. And as you know, with infrastructure projects, that price tag is surely an underestimate of what the reality is going to be. And if you imagine this price tag like this, and I'm sure Hampton Roads, you see numbers like this too, but you imagine this sort of price tag and like average it per acre of coastline across the world or just the United States, we're getting into massive numbers here that for which there's not enough money. There's not enough money anywhere. So, things that they've done to do that, like to deal with that. Previously, we had a ballot measure called Measure AA in the Bay Area, which was a $12 a year parcel tax that was approved by voters to pursue some of the wetland stuff. Interestingly, the public opinion on that was all about wetlands. So like none of the actual sea level rise stuff there was selling the public. It was all about making sure wetlands and biodiversity are protected. And then we've had a lot of state action from Governor Newsom, California legislature. And when Biden was in office, we had some actual federal money coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. But now, of course, with Trump 2.0 in, all the federal money is likely to dry up and provide a big and create a big roadblock. But even all those things together, there's a lot more revenue that needs to be generated. Here's some of the sorts of projects that Measure AA has funded. There's something called the Bay Area Restoration Authority that was set up to administer this money. You can kind of see a mix of gray infrastructure, green infrastructure, and also capacity building, working with disadvantaged communities of various sorts. And then the work continues. So like as part of the follow-up to Bay Adapt, we have the sea level rise adaptation funding investment framework, which was an analysis of where all the projects should be. So like if you look at the map with the kind of shading on the top there, that's like their analysis of projects that have been proposed, studies that have been proposed, plus placeholders where they kind of said, we're going to need something here. We're going to have an estimate of the cost. And then down here at the figure below is like the breakdown of the cost for different sorts of gray and green infrastructure or hybrid infrastructure by county, the counties in the region, excuse me. And that cost is where that 110 billion comes from. But also in that analysis, they said, well, what happens if all the areas flood according to various scenarios and kind of their midline estimate around that, like we do nothing, it's going to cost us $230 billion. So, it's probably, you'd have to kind of radically change these numbers to come to a place where the benefits of adaptation don't pay off in terms of like the cost of infrastructure protected. And there's a lot of critical infrastructure in the Bay. There's nothing rural here for the most part, except like as you go up to like the west in the Suisun Marsh area, that's more kind of like rural. But there's a lot of stuff valuable stuff here. But we only have $5 billion of estimated funding, which means our funding gap is over $100 billion in terms of, and this is before Trump came in. So how we're going to solve this problem is very difficult. And I think this is the same everywhere. It's just a matter of what's the magnitude of that funding gap. So like as part of what's going on to try to deal with this, there's an ongoing working group called Financing the Future, which has lots of different actors, BCDC, trying to figure out what sort of revenue sources, what sort of local, and a lot of it's going to have to be local, more bond acts, hazard resilient district development fees. A lot of the money's going to have to come locally. And I honestly don't think we'll ever have enough money to fully get at this. Okay, key five is the science enterprise. How do we identify the best available science and link it to adaptation planning? And it has to go beyond just having the data or just having the models, um, or just having the maps. What we need is translational capacity. So one of the county planners I talked to said, when we were talking about this, he said, not another portal. We can't have another portal, right? They at the local level. Even this guy was from Marin County. It's a pretty high capacity county, high capacity local planning. But even at that level, um, just having the data laying around out there is not enough. You have to have translational capacity where you have human beings that are specialized in translating the science to the decision makers. There has to be that pipeline. Um, Otherwise, we can just do all the perfect science we want. It just never gets acted on. So we have to be able to link knowledge to action. And there's a lot of interesting work along those lines going on in the Bay Area. So the state of California has some sea level rise guidance. There's actually a new update that's just coming out. So like we have like kind of a consensus around what are the different scenarios and that we should, and the different probabilities, including like these very high extreme scenarios. If we have flooding from and the melting of ice around the world. And then we also have things like this adaptation atlas, and this has become a really interesting planning tool around science in the Bay Area because they organized the Bay Area into these what are called operational landscape units, which are three different types of landscape units that have kind of similar shoreline topography and assets. So it's they each of them has kind of different types of solutions that are more appropriate and are good units for figuring out like how to put projects in. And we use them like in some of our work to say which of these units are you working on and how are they connected from a interdependence perspective. Key six is political leadership, and that really has to come at multiple levels: state, federal, local, community-based. Um, we have in California legislative member organizations, for example, in the state legislature, like the Bay Area Caucus or the Select Committee on Sea Level Rise, where it like focuses legislative attention on these issues. We need executive action at the level of the governor and of course the president to set the agenda within local government, having local elected officials who think that it's an important thing for their constituents to um, pursue sea level rise, and in advocacy networks of various sorts, including networks of environmental justice groups that provide the leadership to participate in planning at the local and regional level. And Trump 2.0 is going to put a big dent in this. Pretty much the loss of um, federal leadership and funding across in the Bay Area. I will say in the Bay Area, like the feds in the Bay Area have not been the drivers. It's mostly been the state and regional actors. But still, the feds and their potential money in particular have always been really an important piece of the puzzle. I got the numbers on the keys wrong. So next key, community engagement. So community engagement, environmental justice, and it are both pieces of like how do we get people to think about sea level rise? How do we engage the community? So we did some um, household level individual behavioral work, myself and a guy named Matt Mildenberger at UC Santa Barbara, where we did surveys of residents in the area. And we asked them and that's the graph at the right, like how much of a risk is sea level rise to you? So is it a risk to you personally, to people in the Bay Area? And the top one are the people who voted for Measure AAA, and the bottom one is the people who oppose Measure AAA. So what you see is two different things here. Is like the risk to them personally that they see is quite low in both of these graphs, right? Only a few people say they have a great deal of personal risk, and as you go further, right, into outside the Bay Area to the U.S., the developing countries now in the future, then people are starting to see the risk. So sea level rise is like mini climate adaptation is it's psychologically distant from people. It's a slow moving natural disaster, kind of the frog in the kettle type of problem. But for people who voted for Measure AA, on average, they see higher risk. So people for whom it is psychologically closer, the problem, more proximate to them, they're more likely to support sea level rise adaptation measures. And this isn't particularly important in environmental justice communities. There's a lot of frontline communities in the Bay Area that are at risk. But they have lots that they're more vulnerable. They lack adaptive capacity, and at the same time, they also have intersectional issues. So it's not just sea level rise for these communities. It's housing, it's education, it's crime, all kinds of different things that intersect with sea level rise, compound the risk of climate adaptation, and make it harder for them to work on it. So that's really an important part of it. This is a picture of it. So there's been a lot of analysis of vulnerable communities using various modeling tools. So, and typically what's happening there is like, you overlay the potential flooding under different scenarios with different indicators of social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, and a lot of people are experimenting with like tools like CalEnviroScreen, which is like looking at multiple indicators of social vulnerability, or the recently lost Justice 40 tool at the federal level the Biden administration did. So there's a lot of work going on around that. And one of the things that we're doing in that area is trying to figure out how these groups work together. So this is a map in the Delta. This is the California Delta, not the Bay, about environmental justice groups in the Delta area and who works with who in those groups. So like there's a big network, and there's centrifugal forces that pull them apart. They're competing for money. There's localism, so they're paying attention to their own backyards. And there's a lot of personality conflict in these groups. There's very strong personalities. And leaders in these communities, sometimes they through this competition, they really get in some fights with each other, have lingering consequences. But there's also centripetal forces that bring that learning from each other, bring them together to build coalitions across shared common issues so that they can effectively, as a group, pursue environmental justice at the regional level, and building system level connectivity so that they're linking across these different interdependencies that I talked about. So a lot of our ongoing work and some of the new work that I'm doing is going to be fleshing out this idea, trying to figure out what are the barriers to frontline communities participating and especially working together across all these networks that they're involved with. So yeah, so this is kind of the summary here of where I think we are. The current report card, I should update this, more like a 7-year report card now, since it's been a while since I updated the report card. I think they're doing well in network governance, BCDC taking a lead agency role, developing the plan with Bay Adapt, the regional shoreline adaptation plan. They've made progress on permitting, but that BRIC project, still we actually need to do some research. There's disagreement on whether or not it's a better or worse, and it's a very interesting topic that somebody should study. I haven't had time to do it. Funding, maybe I should call it a C. It's a very, very difficult problem, and became more difficult with Trump 2.0. Science enterprise, I think, out here in the Bay Area is quite robust. We have things like the State Guidance and Adaptation Atlas and other science products, and a lot of thought about translational capacity. Political leadership is now definitely bifurcated. I think it's fairly strong at the local and state level, although Newsom, there's some complaints about where Newsom is on this, but now it's definitely an F at the federal level. And community engagement, I think, has people pay attention to it. It's a difficult problem, but there's and definitely people are aware of it. But still, when you talk to most of the EJ community leadership, they don't feel they're fully effectively engaged and at the top of the agenda at all times, and that they have to kind of continuously pressure BCDC and other actors to consider their interest. So just in conclusion, climate adaptation requires cooperation across these different types of interdependencies that are created by it. I think there's kind of 7 keys to cooperation related to governance, institutions, and human behavior that can be researched and really are ways to organize how you think about it in our context, and I think also pretty much in any climate adaptation context. Um, Ongoing activities in the Bay Area, I definitely headed in the right direction, but is it fast enough, right? Are we going to get projects on the ground in time to, um, uh, like for example, for a wetland not to be drowned by sea level rise before it gets established? And are they equitable enough? And are we basically going to get the rug pulled out from under us, especially from the funding perspective and maybe other things by, Trump 2.0? So like we're definitely going to be having issues in the next 4 years. I really think these collective action problems and challenges are similar in other regions and for other sorts of issues. So it's not just sea level rise, but other sorts of flooding, fire, extreme heat. I would say I would at least hypothesize that all climate adaptation issues feature these same sorts of interdependencies and collective action problems and polycentric governance. And a lot of these keys to cooperation will need to be pursued. But before we can really fully say that, we need so much more research. We've done a lot in the Bay Area, working, with we and others on Virginia and South Carolina. But that's only 3 regions. We've done some in the Delta. Francesca is now in England. We're looking at it in England. We're looking at it for other issues too. But it's not nearly enough. It's only the tip of the iceberg, and we have nothing really over time. So, well, not nothing, but there's not nearly enough to track how fast these things going, how they go up and down, and things like that. So we need way more research to really fully answer and test all the hypotheses, and even develop all the hypotheses that we need to really understand what's going on here. All right, and I can end there. You can kind of stare. There's a book that Francesca and I put together last year. If you want to kind of get a good summary, and lots of publications that have already been done, and there are more forthcoming. So thanks for listening. Hope you found it interesting, pursuing this quest, and yeah, happy to take questions.
While we give people some time to think about their questions, I did want to note, Mark, that we have done here in Hampton Roads some studies on the costs of inaction. I don't know that we have a comprehensive assessment of the costs of adaptation, but I think when you pointed out kind of that gap between what funding is available and even not making much of a dent in terms of the cost of adaptation, one part of me wonders kind of what the the literature talks about trying to stay away from the doom and gloom message about climate and sea level rise. And when you compare the cost of inaction to the cost of adaptation and then the funding that's available, what are your thoughts then kind of about what message is being sent about our capacity to actually do something then?
Well, I mean, it's a big worry. There's no doubt about that. But I think the selling point that people use is the cost benefit analysis is like, look, the benefits that the cost of doing it are actually way lower than the actual benefits of doing that protection, right? Like the avoided damages are so big that's like it passes the cost benefit test quite easily. But the sad thing, there is that the benefits are kind of like long term, and it's not like you're getting money out of it, right? It's like you're avoiding damages. So it's not like an investment that you put in the adaptation and you get more money back out of it, right? It's like you put in the adaptation, you avoid losses. So that's kind of a harder type of cost benefit analysis for people to pursue. But I do think that's the positive, the way to frame it as like not being such a huge gap that you're paralyzed. And certainly here in the Bay Area, we're not paralyzed. There's a lot of activity both in the legislature and these committees, BCDC, different ways of trying to be creative, bringing in the private sector. thinking about new local revenue programs. It's an ongoing informal discussion for the most part about how do we get like Facebook and Google, a lot of their facilities and where their employees work are right at risk in the South Bay there. So, yeah, despite that, the discussions are definitely continuing.
I see Jesse on video and unmuting himself. Jesse, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting discussion. I have first just sort of a technical question. Early on, you presented these results of in terms of physical adaptation, kind of cooperation problems, where building a seawall around one region would substantially, it looked like from the map, raise sea levels in other places. And I'm just wondering what the mapping assumptions are, because it seems to me like that there's a challenge that the bay is flows out to the ocean, right? So you build a seawall, for the most part, as sea level rise happens, you're the water can flow in and out. So I'm wondering how you get several feet higher sea levels elsewhere because of a wall around one municipality.
Yeah, so
Part of the
so
water ocean.
So I can only really answer that at kind of a high level. I'm gonna, with all those technical details, I definitely will refer you to the work of Mark Stacy and Michelle Hummel because they've done all that modeling. So that they're kind of my partners on the engineering side and the coastal hydrodynamics side who have the expertise on what the technical details are. But you know, those numbers are kind of illustrative in this. Number one, we're armoring the whole coastline, so it's like to kind of show what it's simulating armoring the whole coastline, and then the hydrodynamic consequences of that you raise the seawall given the tides. How much would you expect it? And then of course there's different sea level rise scenarios that you have to build in there. So that was just one scenario. I'm even forgetting exactly what it is, but it could be higher or lower. It could be less or more of the shoreline. So it's kind of illustrative there. And Mark Stacy and Michelle in particular have done a lot of work on like various um, uh, uh, exploring that parameter space in various ways. But there's also something that I think is interesting about the hydrodynamics of the bay. Like you said, it's all going out through Golden Gate. So it's kind of a narrowly constrained estuary, right? In a narrowly constrained bay. So it's like really this big bathtub. And it could be like in other places that are more open, that those sorts of interdependencies are quite different, which means and definitely demand modeling. Maybe Chesapeake is different than some of the open, more gentle coastlines of the East Coast are going to be quite different from that perspective. But it needs to be modeled, and the like the extent of it, how severe the interdependencies are, how widespread they are. It's going to depend on all kinds of different things that are local to the coastline, including levels of development, how close it is, the topography, and the amount of sea level rise that you might expect under different scenarios.
I will just chime in. I think you got exactly right. Everywhere has got some similarities, but a lot of differences. You know, like right now, Norfolk is, got plans to build its seawall higher, longer, complex tide gates, and so on. Portsmouth would probably like to have something similar, but there's a level of governance, I believe, in Hampton Roads that each individual city has to have like a Corps of Engineers study. There's not a collective Hampton Roads metro government entity. There's a planning district, but not the equivalent regional government. I wonder if that's got a parallel, out there, or maybe there's just a level of cooperation that's missing here.
No, I definitely think, I mean, every local government, has their various plans of various sorts, and getting them all linked up is one of the really important things. And in our context, we do have BCDC and a regional plan around that, and now we have this state bill that mandates that these local governments actually participate in developing their own sub-regional plans that are consistent with BCDC. So that's like a little bit more of a, that's a kind of a stronger mechanism that's been in there before, so that there's some mandates at the local level to do things. But I would say what you're describing is pretty much, you know, kind of universal. Lots of local governments, their own plans, their own regulatory requirements, may or may not be thinking about how their decisions affect other local governments, and some entity of regional governance, planning district or something that could be in place with stronger, more or less capacity, more or less money, more or less kind of authority to try to like shape the decision making of those local governments.
Eileen?
I'm not sure this is really a question, but it's, so when I hear about things like this, the numbers that are thrown around are billions and billions of dollars to do something. And that, those are the kinds of numbers that people aren't used to dealing with, or in a state like California where there's state support for all of this. Where do you start? I mean, what's the $1.98 project that would get you started towards the billions of dollars that it will take to do the whole plan? Or have you?
Yeah, I mean it's an all hands on deck and get whatever you can get situation. So, you know, Measure AAA is something that was passed, you know, at the local level. We had a bond act in the recent election. At the state level, it's kind of, California tends to fund things at the state level, these bond acts. So we did have a climate resilience bond act that has some money for the Bay Area. And then, you know, there's a lot of hope around the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and things like that. There's other bills like you may have seen that legislative bill tractor, but there's other bills that are for more specialized projects. So that's all stuff that people are trying to do. I think one of the places where we need a lot more innovation and are going to need a lot more work is at the local level. So like things like climate resilience districts, which are like small special districts that have taxation capacity, you know, that to generate revenue, probably gonna need more bond acts. You know, finding the local level money is really one of the places, but it's like people are doing stuff and it's always going to be incremental, and you know, it's always going to be chasing that 110 and or whatever it may be in the end, you know, some hundreds of billions. And we're just going to have to do the best we can with as we incrementally chase that money.
Yeah, no, it's just, it's a big number and people aren't used to thinking in terms of that. And that's why I was wondering about smaller scale types of things. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like all the individual projects are kind of smaller scale, right? It's like, and that's kind of how the money is chased. The money is chased at the level of individual projects. So an individual road project or a wetlands project, where are we going to get the money for this? And that those are the things that add up. So people are, you know, there's pots of money out there, federal, state, local, and then these entities at the local level who want to do a particular project, they're applying for that money. And so a lot of it is done project by project, and then you have to add that up over some number of years to think about, you know, how much money is fully going to be spent on it. But it's going to be better over the long run is if we do that well and work together to increase the size of the pot, right? Like, right, for example, lobbying at the state level or the federal level to increase the size of it, but also spending the money in a more coordinated way so that we prioritize the adaptation projects that are on the ground that have regional benefits. And that's one of the things the modeling can do is like where, you know, back to the earlier question, like where do you put these projects that would have the highest value in terms of the benefits of, you know, avoided damages, but also not as much regional spillovers or like maybe even regional benefits in some fashion that would not just be accruing to at the local level. So that still has to be stuff that needs to be worked on here, pretty much everywhere, I'd say.
Yeah, thank you. Good seminar, very interesting.
Thank you.
I do think we might have time for one more question if there are any other questions. John, go ahead.
Hi, Mark.
Uh,
I'm going to ask a nasty question,
oh boy.
and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it seems that the people with political power and wealth are able to do things in their neighborhood that might not be the best place to spend the money. So, is there any kind of mechanism or recognition of targeting, as you say, the most effective thing, even if it's not, um, going to benefit the people with the political power? Is there any way around that, or is that just what we're stuck with?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we've really put a dent in those dynamics, and I 100% agree with you on that. You definitely see richer communities in the Bay Area, and there's some extremely rich communities right there in the
Sure.
shoreline of the Bay Area that are already pursuing adaptation projects of various sorts. And if anybody comes and tells them what to do or not to do, or says take the money elsewhere, there's a big fight on their hands. And so it's like that's a very hard dynamic. And then the flip side of it are these disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, which may or may not have like the same amount of property value or stuff like that. But they have a really hard time having the capacity to chase the money because they don't have like the expertise, the time with all the intersection issues to work on that. So trying to like aim that money at the regional level, aim the money and increase the capacity to those disadvantaged communities is one of the things that's happening. So it's kind of swimming upstream against the sort of political dynamics you're talking about. I will say that one of the things that I hope we may do in this new project is actually take an equity lens to that analysis in the sense of like, let's pretend that we fund all of the projects in just the disadvantaged communities. Like, what does that do for these patterns of interdependence and the sort of costs and the benefits of things? Because that type of analysis that really hits hard on like prioritizing or focusing in some fashion on the disadvantaged communities has not really been done yet. And that would be a good thing, a good analysis to do.
If I could take one more minute, uh, one of the problems that's been recognized locally is the use of cost benefit to justify projects where cost is the value of the property or the value of businesses or something, and instead to look more at community resilience or how many people would be affected rather than how expensive is the house. And so I'm wondering if there's been any movement away from the Corps of Engineers, and sorry to pick on them, cost of the structures versus the cost of the or the money equivalent benefit of the society that would be protected.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that people are aware of that issue and have discussed it. But I haven't seen any real concrete change because it requires changes at the federal level, like
Sure.
in federal law, in Army Corps of Engineers regulation. So that tends to be kind of a sticking point and a constraint on what the Corps can do. I think the if we would study that integrated regulatory process a little bit closer, we'd probably get some better answers around that. But I also think that at the local level, it's important to have kind of allies in the Corps of Engineers, people that kind of want to pursue that idea that you talked about and are kind of like on the same page as that, but think creatively about how you can do that while navigating the regulatory environment of the Corps of Engineers and not trying to do something like change it at the federal level. Because I don't feel like change at the federal level, especially now around what the Corps of Engineers does, is going to be coming anytime soon.
Thank you. Again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, and I think your response is the practical one, is that it requires change at a more systemic level, and it's going to take a while. So just keep beating the drum, and maybe we can get somebody to listen.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.